Welcome to episode 366 of FBI Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Thomas Larned, who served in the FBI for 24 years. In this episode, Tom reviews two fraud cases he investigated when assigned to the Fort Myers resident agency out of the Tampa Division: the VR Labs wire fraud investigation and the Orion Bank failure. At the time of Tom's investigation, Orion was the largest privately owned bank in the state of Florida. The Orion Bank failure cost the FDIC $884 million. In the second case, Tom reviews his investigation of VR Labs owners Kay and Robert Gow and business partner John Williams for cheating Lee County, Florida's taxpayers out of $5 million. During Tom's career, he assumed various roles as a case agent and as an FBI senior executive. He was assigned to the Miami Division, the Boston Division, FBI headquarters, Iraq, Canada, and the Tampa Division. As a special agent and field supervisor, Tom successfully investigated transnational criminal organizations engaged in violent crime, drug trafficking, healthcare fraud, and financial institution fraud. As the legal attaché in Iraq, Tom directed FBI operations during Operation Iraqi Freedom, managing over 130 personnel in collaboration with U.S. military and intelligence agencies. Tom later served as the FBI's legal attaché in Canada. Tom was also an assistant special agent in charge, ASAC, in the Boston field office, where he oversaw the Whitey Bulger fugitive investigation and crisis management operations, including SWAT, hostage negotiations, and emergency response teams. He was also a team leader for the inspection division. Tom was recognized 3 times as the United States Attorney's Law Enforcement Officer of the Year for his exceptional investigative leadership and impact on high-profile cases. While leading the Orion Bank investigation, he received the Council of Inspector General's Integrity and Efficiency Award for outstanding contributions to law enforcement oversight and investigative integrity. He also received the FBI Combat Theater Operations Medal for distinguished service in Iraq, leading critical security and operational missions in a high-risk environment. After his retirement from the FBI, Tom worked as a senior consultant for the Free Group. He is currently the president and CEO of the Justice Group, Incorporated, providing consulting and support solutions to law enforcement and healthcare providers. Tom is also an author working on his first crime fiction series. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com. You'll also find links to where you can buy me a cup of coffee, join my reader team about crime fiction and the FBI and books, TV, and movies, and learn more about me and my books. Thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, retired agent, Tom Larned. Hi, Tom. How are you?
Hi, Jerry. Great to talk to you.
I was a white-collar crime agent, so I love cases that involved financial shenanigans.
Okay, so this is going to be really interesting because I was a violent crime investigator. And so you're going to probably be able to ask a lot of questions about financial crime that I don't know the answers to. But I'll try to make this one interesting anyway.
Oh, that is interesting. I'm very excited that you are going to talk to us about 2 white-collar crime cases that you worked when you were assigned to the Fort Myers resident agency out of the Tampa office. The first one is going to be about a bank fraud case where I'm not too happy about the name of the subject. And the other one is a case that you initially opened as a corruption case, but eventually became a case where you charge wire fraud.
Yes.
So we'll do both of those cases and have a 2-for-1 case review in this episode. So where do you want to start?
Well, I'll start with a little background on the Orion Bank investigation. So Orion Bank was the top performing bank in the state of Florida, second largest bank in the state of Florida, sort of the crown jewel of Southwest Florida, of Naples. There were about 30 branches around the state. And its president, CEO, chairman of the board, Jerry Williams, no relation. No relation to you.
No relations to me.
But Jerry was a pillar of the community, very wealthy, successful banker. In fact, he'd won Community Banker of the Year award. And, it was just a very successful bank. Its business model was to make money by borrowing from the federal government at 2% and then lending money out to commercial real estate developers primarily at 4%. And it was a very successful model. For probably 15 years, they had never charged off a loan. But in the mid-2000s, the real estate business was tanking. And so what was happening to Orion was that many of the developers were unable to sell the properties. And so developers were going bankrupt, which meant that Orion Bank was not getting paid. And they were becoming vulnerable because they had what you would understand non-performing assets or distressed assets on their books because the values were not what they had been when the money was lent out. And they also had a lack of cash reserves because they weren't getting paid. And so the regulators came to Jerry and told Jerry Williams, the CEO president, and told him that he needed to raise capital. But at least from the regulator's perspective, Jerry was reluctant to raise capital by selling shares of stock because he was the majority shareholder and he didn't want to dilute his shares of stock.
Even though they weren't worth as much as his initial investment.
Right. And so part of what happened to Jerry was his net worth was about $127 million, but eventually about $126 million of it was tied up in Orion stock. And so he couldn't afford to risk those shares of stock becoming diluted because it was really all of his wealth. So what Jerry decided to do when he realized that he needed to raise capital, he couldn't get institutional investors who were interested anymore because of the state of the economy. And so what he did is he went to some of Orion's really wealthy customers and he proposed that he would lend money to them since they didn't want to put up their own money. He would lend them money to buy shares of Orion Bank stock. And you probably know, I didn't know this, but you probably know that happens to be illegal. Essentially, what Jerry was trying to do was to create the illusion that he was raising capital so that the regulators would go away. And what Jerry ended up doing was he approached one of his wealthy investors by the name of Francesco Mileto, a wealthy customer, I should say. He went to Frank and he proposed to Frank that he would lend Frank, ultimately became $82 million for the purpose of Frank then purchasing $15 million of Orion Bank stock and also Frank to purchase distressed assets and take them off of Orion's balance sheet.
When I hear somebody taking a loan of $80 million, I'm assuming they have some type of business proposal or business plan where they're developing a real estate complex or something. What was it that he was supposed to be doing with this $80 million?
So supposedly Mileto was so wealthy that he could afford to carry those distressed assets on his own balance sheet until the real estate market turned around, so that he was buying them at a discounted price from Orion and that in 5 or 7 years, they'd be worth a lot of money. And then he could either finish the developments and sell the properties, or he could just sell the development to developers at a profit. One of the things that we joked about later, once we learned all the facts of the case, is how somebody like you or I can go into a bank and ask for, $500,000 to get a mortgage to buy a house. And the bank wants, to take one of your kidneys as collateral. But what we learned is if you go into a bank and ask them for $50-60 million, they don't want to embarrass you by asking you too many questions.
So. Yeah, heavens forbid that you embarrass the multi-millionaire or billionaire by asking too many questions. Okay.
So what happened was the regulators figured out that Jerry had authorized and funded what's known as a round-trip transaction. That is, that the money was going out of Orion Bank into these nominee borrowers and entities that were created for the purpose of this transaction. And then the money was immediately being turned around and funneled back into Orion Bank to create the illusion that there'd been this infusion of cash into the bank, as well as these distressed assets had been removed off the bank's books. The regulators figured out what had happened, and they ordered Jerry removed as the chairman of the board, as the CEO of the bank. And then about 5 days later, the state of Florida shut down Orion Bank. So the bank failed with a loss to the deposit insurance fund of about $800 million.
Wow. And this again is during that time period of the 2008 real estate crash, where there were a lot of risky lending practices and subprime mortgage crisis and all of that. So I guess the regulators were looking for this. They had already experienced it at other banks, and so they're looking for this, and that's why he wasn't able to fool them.
Yeah, and really the regulators don't deserve a lot of credit. You know, they allowed this to go on for far too long without really taking any action. They'd entered into a formal written agreement with Jerry. They had issued a prompt corrective action, but they had not taken the sort of aggressive steps that needed to be taken. And essentially, Jerry was just too powerful, not only at Orion, but his influence with the regulators as well was pretty significant. You know, when he was basically flaunting in their face that he was going to raise this capital to try to make the books look better than they were, they finally took action against him. And as I said, and then pretty much immediately after that, the bank failed, which was a huge tragedy for the community here. There's a lot of people that lost their jobs, lost all of their shares in the stock and in the bank. And I'll get into that a little bit more, what we learned. So what happened was Nicole Wade was the new chief prosecutor in the Middle District of Florida, federal prosecutor. And she had a team of investigators, Brian Tucker from IRS. She had Jim Sweat from the FDIC OIG, Steve Carroll from the Federal Reserve Board OIG, and Ed Slagle from SIGTARP, the Special Inspector General for the Troubled Asset Relief Program. So these were really talented financial investigators. She was certain that there would be civil and administrative penalties, but she wanted an FBI agent assigned to the case because she wanted to make sure that if there was any criminal accountability, that was being addressed. I volunteered for the assignment, even though I didn't have experience in that area. I was challenged by a defense attorney at one point about my lack of knowledge of the vocabulary and the terms. And I acknowledged that they were right. But I said, but I do know the difference between the truth and a lie. So I felt like I was qualified to participate in the investigation.
So what squad were you on at the time?
I was out of the Fort Myers RA, out of the Tampa field office.
All right. So you did a little bit of everything.
Yeah, I was assigned to do public corruption when I got to Fort Myers, and I was helping another agent who had a big gang case up, which was my background, and I was helping him to get a wire. There was police corruption involved. He needed a prosecutor, and so I went to Nicole and said, he really needs a dedicated prosecutor. She said that she would take that gang case on personally, but she wanted an FBI agent on Orion, and so that was the quid pro quo. I agreed to work the Orion case with her. So we began interviewing the Orion employees and the shareholders. One of the first things we learned was that Orion employees had warned Jerry that he could not lend money to Frank Miletto for the purchase, or for anyone else for that matter, for the purpose of purchasing stock in the bank. Also, Miletto already had $41 million outstanding in Orion Bank loans, and to lend him any more money would violate Florida's legal lending limit. So Orion's employees had warned Jerry that for that reason, he couldn't lend any money to Miletto either.
Do you happen to know what the legal lending limit is?
My understanding is it's based on a percentage of the bank's outstanding assets. And I'm not exactly sure what the calculation was, but at $41 million, Miletto had about as much money extended to him as the law would allow. The $82 million loan pushed him way over that. So one of the things that we learned from interviewing bank employees was that Jerry Williams was requiring all of the employees to invest in what's known as the ESOP, the Employee Stock Option Plan. And it was a way of expanding the bank's capital because all of the employees' retirement shares, et cetera, were going into Orion Bank. In fact, he was forcing employees that came from other institutions to convert, meaning essentially roll over their stock from other institutions into Orion banks. And there were employees, because of the state of the economy, who wanted to withdraw money from the ESOP. And Jerry, as the chairman of the board, wasn't letting them. In fact, there was one woman whose husband was dying of cancer, and she requested an exception, and he denied that. But at the same time, Jerry was withdrawing his shares from Orion Bank stock. He even went so far as to force the ESOP to purchase $1 million of his shares in the bank because he needed the capital. And the ESOP didn't have any money, so they had to go borrow $1 million in order to fund Jerry's lavish lifestyle. He owned a private plane. He lived an expensive lifestyle. But he was taking cash out of the bank at a time when it was undercapitalized and it needed the cash, not his stock at that point. So the starting point in my mind was to talk to Frank Miletto to find out about this $82 million loan, to find out the legitimacy of it. As you suggested, you would think that there would be, a pretty well thought out plan for what he was going to do with the $82 million, aside from taking custody of distressed assets and purchasing bank stock. So when we were preparing to interview Miletto, we were looking through the documentation that he had submitted as part of his application package to show his creditworthiness, to show his financial strength. And I was looking at one of the bank accounts. It supposedly had about $10 million in it, but the pages, like from one page to the next, had different years on them, and they almost looked like they'd been cut and pasted documents. The figures didn't add up. And of course, that didn't necessarily mean anything. It was something that we would interview Miletto about. But he also had this trust instrument that showed that he was the beneficiary of tens of millions of dollars annually from these Italian oil leases. So we really weren't all that concerned about the inconsistencies in his bank statements. Again, he'd been a customer for years. Maybe the loan files had gotten mixed up, but we subpoenaed his actual bank statement just to be sure. And again, this account was supposed to have $10 million in it. It had less than $2,000 in it.
Wow, that's what we call a clue.
Yeah.
Something's wrong.
And then the next clue that happened was when the FBI legal attaché from Rome told us, after reviewing Miletto's trust document, that document was fraudulent. So now what we're looking at is that Frank Miletto is a pretty slick con man. And so when we went to interview Miletto, it became pretty apparent that in fact he was a con man. He fairly quickly agreed to cooperate, agreed to plead guilty, and to testify, because his position was this wasn't his idea. This was Jerry Williams' idea. Jerry had approached him offering the $82 million. He's going to get $15 million in Orion Bank stock. He's going to get these assets that he can't afford, but Jerry's giving him a line of credit of $26 million that Frank Miletto can use to pay the interest on the loans. So this money wasn't costing Frank a thing. And so in his mind, he was justifying and agreeing to the terms.
Let me ask you, did Jerry Williams, it's hard for me to say that, but did Jerry Williams know that Frank was really a con man, that he was not worth all the millions that he had said he was worth?
So from interviewing Miletto and the employees at the West Palm Beach branch of Orion Bank that had originated the loan, they told us that prior to the loans closing, Frank Miletto's loans closing at the end of June, which was the end of the second quarter of 2009, that they had discovered what we had discovered about the bank statements and the trust, and that they knew that Frank Miletto was a fraud.
I'm glad to hear that, because when you said that they don't like to ask the multimillionaires and billionaires too many questions, well, don't ask, just look.
Again, they had loaned him $41 million previously without having detected the fact that he was a fraud. So it came about during the due diligence on this loan package, the $82 million one, that they finally discovered it. And in fact, these employees told us that they had sent a fax to Jerry Williams laying out what they had discovered, and that the fact that Frank Miletto was in fact a fraud. So we went and talked to those employees' supervisor, Angel Gerzon, who was the senior vice president for the West Palm Beach branch. And Angel, he had signed off on the loan, but he confessed that they knew that Miletto was a fraud, that his employees had warned executive management at the bank that Miletto was a fraud, but that Jerry wanted to fund the loan anyways. And so Gerzon signed off on it. And as a result, Gerzon was going to take a plea agreement for his participation in the conspiracy.
And it sounds to me that the reason that they went through with it was because they knew he was a con man and that he would fall in line and do what they wanted him to do.
That seems to be the case.
Yeah, I can imagine. I hope that a real billionaire, whose money was based on a legitimate business would say, I'm not doing that, and would not want to risk their millions or their reputation in a fraudulent scheme like this.
I agree with you 100%. You would think that a person that had a successful business career would have some integrity. But as you well know, that's not always the case. So we had Mileto on board. We had Angel Gerzon on board. Next up the line was Pete Campine, who was the executive vice president for the East Coast of Orion Bank. And we wanted to interview Pete. Unfortunately, I was contacted by a homicide detective during the investigation who informed me that Pete Campine had been found dead at his office. So that introduced a whole new other element that we had to look into to determine whether his death was somehow connected to our investigation and the Orion Bank failure.
What, did you think someone had purposely tried to kill him to stop him from talking?
So that is something that we had to consider, that possibility. I don't want to get into that too much because I've done public record searches and I don't really see a whole lot out there that I feel comfortable discussing about, what we discovered.
All right. So I'm not going to ask you the question, but my next thought is that this may have been self-inflicted.
Yeah, I'm not going to comment on his cause of death because I don't see anything in the public record that discloses it.
That's fair.
Obviously, we couldn't talk to Pete Campine. Next on the list was Tom Hebel, who was the number 2 for Orion Bank. He was the executive vice president out of the headquarters in Naples. And Tom was somebody who clearly was respected by the Orion Bank employees, a great leader, someone that they really admired. They expressed that they were terrified of Jerry Williams, but the employees at the bank really thought the world of Tom Hebel. When we went to talk to Tom, it was a very emotional day. Pete Campine had just died. Pete and Tom were very close. And, obviously the bank had failed and, the employees had lost their jobs and their life savings. And Tom was in a difficult spot. But he talked at length about the bank and all the great work the bank had done over the years and the people at the bank and what they had done for the community. And we'd been listening for several hours. And I finally said, Tom, I can see how much, Orion means to you, how much your people mean to you. It must have been really difficult for you to ask them to do something that you knew was wrong. And he looked up at me and it gave him pause. And I said, Tom, you've done a lot of really great things in your life, but you had a bad day. And he started sobbing and said, a really bad day. And from there, Tom began to confess and told us the story of what had happened, how Jerry had ordered this to close. And you could be argued that Jerry was trying to save the bank, but it was also clear that Jerry was trying to save his own personal finances as well. I said to Tom, some of your employees told us that there had been a fax sent to you and Jerry disclosing the fact that Frank Mileto was a fraud. And Tom said that did happen. It was sent to Jerry's office. Tom said he was in the office when the fax came in. And I asked him, did you look at that fax? And he told me that he had. I asked him, had Jerry? He said, yes, Jerry read it. And I said, and what did Jerry do? And he said he crumpled the fax up in a ball and threw it in the trash. And so we sort of sat with that for a minute. And then I said, did there ever come a time when you wish you had pulled that fax out of the trash? And Tom said, yes, that had happened. And I said, did you pull it out? And he said that he had. So I asked him where the fax was, and he pointed to his briefcase. And it was something because the other investigators kind of got up and wanted to seize the briefcase. And I was like, hang on, guys, this is evidence. We've got to collect this the right way and process this the right way. And at this point in the day, it had been a long day and Tom was cooperating. And so the energy had changed. There was a lot of sort of joking and teasing going on. And the investigative team started making fun of me that I wanted to process this piece of paper that had been sitting in Tom Hebel's briefcase for 3 years, that I wanted to process it for fingerprints. But I'd had good luck with getting fingerprints off of documents before. And in fact, Jerry Williams' fingerprints were on that facsimile.
Wow. Talking about a smoking gun.
Yeah. So we had Mileto cooperating, we had Angel Gerzon, we had Tom Hebel, and now we had the facts. And so we approached Jerry. He was defiant and he wanted to go to trial. But about a year later, on the eve of trial, Jerry agreed to plead guilty, and he went into court and gave a statement to the court, Judge Honeywell, telling her that he was trying to save the bank. And she said, I think it was more about greed, really, than it was about saving the bank. She said that it was really about saving Jerry Williams. And she sentenced him to 6 years in prison and ordered him to pay $31 million in restitution. Angel Gerzon and Tom Hebel also pleaded guilty. Each of them served 2.5 years in prison, and Frank Mileto served 5.5 years in prison. That's sort of, in a nutshell, the Orion Bank investigation.
Did the other three men, including Frank Mileto, were they required to pay restitution?
Yes, they were all jointly responsible for paying the restitution.
Because I'd love to know how much of that $81 million Frank returned to the government.
Yeah, there was litigation for several years. There was a law firm that was holding the funds in escrow. The reality of it is to the extent that the FDIC ever recovered any money, it wasn't going back to any of the shareholders or the bank employees. It was all going to the deposit insurance fund. So those shareholders, employees of the banks truly, were harmed and terrible. And, and Tom Hebel, too, I got to know Tom pretty well. One of the hardest things on him was that he could never be a banker again. He loved to be a banker, and he was banned from it forever. And, his family suffered so much. And obviously the loss of his friend Pete Campine and all of his employees went through. It was, I didn't understand the impact that a white-collar crime case can have on a community. And so Orion Bank was really an eye-opener for me.
This case is definitely, brings a lot of understanding, about the importance of white-collar crime cases. I don't know what's being worked by the Bureau when it comes to white-collar crime and financial crime and economic crime cases, but I know that when it comes to criminal jurisdiction, that we were one of the main agency, working these cases. So I hope we're still working them.
Yeah, I do too. I know what you see in the news these days about the FBI's priorities. It seems to be focused on violent crime, which of course is what my whole career really was. So I support that. But I also understand that the white collar crime, whether it's in financial institution or in the healthcare fraud,
Or corruption, public corruption.
Absolutely, public corruption. Don't get me started on that. I mentioned to you that I've these books, and a lot of it has to do with corruption.
Well, thanks, Tom. That case review about Orion Bank was, as I say about all of my cases, really fascinating. But I know you have another case that is equally as interesting. And this one you also worked when you were in the Fort Myers resident agency, and it involves illegal monetary transactions. So where do you want to start?
I want to start by thanking you for your kind words about the Orion Bank investigation. So the second case we're going to present here was about VR Labs. And VR Labs was a company that applied for tens of millions of dollars in grants and bonds from Lee County, which is where Fort Myers is located, Southwest Florida. They had a program called the FIRST program, which stood for Financial Incentives for Recruiting Strategic Targets. Beginning in the mid-2000s, Southwest Florida's economy was devastated due to Hurricanes Charlie and Wilma, and then followed by the collapse of the real estate market, as we discussed in the Orion Bank investigation. The FIRST program was created to encourage targeted industries to operate in Lee County in order to create jobs. So, for example, Hertz moved its corporate headquarters to Southwest Florida under the FIRST program. And one of Lee County's targeted industries was biotech. In their application submitted to Lee County, Robert and Kay Gow, the owners of VR Labs, described the company and its affiliated company, Herbal Science Group, as well-established international enterprises. And Herbal Science Group in particular was a Singapore-based biotech company that produced nutraceuticals that could be used to treat a variety of health conditions in place of traditional medicines. For example, I think that they promoted a urinary tract remedy. I'm assuming you're going to ask, what is a nutraceutical? So, because the Gows were the first people I had ever heard to use the term nutraceutical. But
Yeah, I've never heard of it before.
so I looked it up for you, and it is now accepted and regulated by the FDA as a product that is derived from plant extracts and produces a pharmaceutical effect and has a proven efficacy and therapeutic influence on patient care. Herbal Science Group's products were produced in liquid format as opposed to powder or capsule. And VR Labs, which was also owned by Robert and Kay Gow, had developed a proprietary bottling line that could fill liquid nutraceuticals in a manner that ensured each bottle received the exact dosage of the beneficial ingredients, something the industry had not yet achieved. Now, as part of the proposal, VR Labs agreed to build a manufacturing plant in Lee County that would serve as the headquarters for both VR Labs and Herbal Science Group. So Herbal Science Group was going to move from Singapore. This would make Lee County a pioneer in both the research and development as well as the production and distribution of nutraceuticals. And VR Labs would invest $9 million of its own money into the project. So ultimately, Lee County approved a $5 million grant to VR Labs. The grant money was to be paid out in the form of reimbursements for certain expenses such as construction of the plant, building the bottling line, paying employees. And in exchange for the grant, VR Labs was required to create jobs for 208 employees with an average annual salary of $70,000 approximately. And as proof of its prior success in biotech, Herbal Science Group had received $28 million from two very reputable investment groups just 3 years earlier. So there was an apparent history of success and credibility within the industry, and it seemed like a viable business concept. And the principals involved had impressive pedigrees. VR Labs founder Robert Gow had exceptional marketing skills, and he charmed people with a certain mystery. He held himself out as a former CIA officer who was closely associated with President George Bush 41. He had photographs in his office of both Bush 41 and 43, and I believe a photograph of himself at a fundraiser for Jeb Bush. Although Robert Gow and his wife Kay Gow were not well among the Naples elites, they had donated an ancient Chinese art collection to the local museum. In fact, the first floor of the museum was named after them. Additionally, Robert Gow had hired Jeff Kottkamp to serve as VR Labs CEO, and Jeff Kottkamp was an attorney who had just left office after serving as Florida's lieutenant governor, where he had been a leader in efforts to grow Florida's biotech economy. So on its face, the grant to VR Labs seemed like a great idea. So how did the VR Labs investigation begin? My partner on the case, John Kufta, had opened an investigation into a county commissioner named Tammy Hall because of some irregular expenses on Tammy's financial disclosures. And when John and another agent, Brett Hood, interviewed her, Tammy Hall admitted to having misused the campaign funds. But John and Brett had received transfer orders and they were both leaving the Tampa field office. So I took over the Tammy Hall investigation. And Tammy was facing 20 years in prison, and she agreed to take a plea and cooperate. And Tammy told me she had been contacted by some of the Lee County employees who were involved in the due diligence that was performed prior to the commissioners voting to approve the grant to VR Labs. These employees felt the grant to VR Labs had been rushed through the approval process, and they wondered whether the relationship between commissioners and the former lieutenant governor, who became VR Labs CEO, had been a factor in the approval process. When we interviewed the commissioners, they justified the speed in which the grant was processed because Lee County's economy was on its knees, and as a result, the commissioners were desperate to create jobs. Then Tammy introduced us to local business owners who had been hired to build a plant for VR Labs, but were not being paid for their work. As a result, the general contractor and subcontractors, one of them was a roofing company, the other installed the air conditioning, they'd performed their work and they were having to lay off employees because they weren't being paid.
But VR Labs had $5 million. They had gotten this grant to pay them.
So a grant was approved, but under the terms of the grant, VR Labs was required to pay its subcontractors and then submit for reimbursement. Well, what they were doing is the contractors were doing the work and submitting invoices, and they showed me the emails that had exchanging with VR Labs. And what became clear is that although Robert Gow was the face of the organization, Kay Gow was really running operations and was making decisions about who to pay and who not to pay. She was submitting the invoices to the county, etc. And she was really extremely methodical in documenting the reasons she was withholding payment from the subcontractors. For example, they'd placed liens on VR Labs manufacturing plant because they hadn't been paid for the work that'd been performed. And I went through those emails over and over because, again, I was new at white collar crime and didn't really know anything about business either. And I'm a big fan of timelines to try to untangle a gnarl of accusations and counter accusations. And through the timeline, it became clear that VR Labs had invoiced the county and been paid for the work performed by the subcontractors, yet the subcontractors had not been paid. According to Kay Gow, the contractors were not in compliance with the terms of the grant or their engagements. However, as we mentioned, VR Labs was supposed to be paying the upfront construction costs and invoicing the county for reimbursement, but VR was being paid by the county for expenses it had yet to incur. So reading Kay Gow's communications with these contractors was a combination of comical and frustrating. It was kind of like watching Who's on First, and it did feel like she was stalling payments to contractors and then blaming them, which might have been unethical, but wasn't necessarily criminal. But also, if you remember, I'd mentioned VR Labs was required to create 208 jobs. And at the time, this was probably a year after they'd received the grant, they'd only created 2 jobs, and one of them went to their daughter. So, they're not hiring people. The subcontractors are laying people off. So rather than creating jobs for Lee County, this arrangement is losing jobs for Lee County. So it seemed that the county and the contractors might be able to prevail in court against VR Labs, but we weren't sure the case should be prioritized over FBI investigations that were sitting unaddressed until we started digging into Robert Gow, who was a fascinating man. He was born in 1933. He'd attended Yale. His roommate was the President Bush 41's cousin. Like Bush 41, Gow was a member of the Skull and Bones Secret Society at Yale. And after graduating Yale, Gow told people he joined the CIA. During the 60s, Gow was recruited by former President Bush to work at Zapata Oil, which is a company that George Bush at 41 had formed. And Gow eventually succeeded Bush as the president of Zapata, just for entertainment's sake. I found articles from an investigative reporter who suspected that Zapata Oil served as a front to fund clandestine operations for the CIA, such as the Bay of Pigs. And when the reporter tried to dig further into that, he was told the Zapata files from the relevant time period of the 60s had been inadvertently destroyed just after President Bush became the vice president.
I hate when that happens.
Yeah, and it's all extraneous to this story, but it was fascinating. And this is where things got interesting from the investigator's perspective. While I was reviewing a declassified letter written by Robert Gow and released by the CIA, I noticed his middle initial was P, as in Papa. And I remembered that our Robert Gow's middle initial was T, as in Tango. So the Bush family actually has a liaison person from the FBI that I reached out to and confirmed that the VR Labs Robert T. Gow, who represented himself as a former CIA officer and a friend of the Bushes, that individual that got the grant from Lee County actually had no association with the Bush family.
Wow, but he capitalized on that confusion, or intentionally confused people.
Well, that certainly, was what we needed to investigate, right? There were investors as well as the county's grant. And yes, there were certainly people, everybody that we interviewed thought that he was some mysterious former CIA figure with a lot of power. And we'll get to it a little further in, but just reading the emails between him and others, they definitely thought he was this big, powerful man. I looked at it like, well, okay, he likes to pretend he's the different Robert Gow. He's a CIA clandestine operator and he's a friend of the Bushes. Who wouldn't like to throw that around at cocktail parties? It didn't mean that VR Labs and Urban Science Groups were not successful businesses. But then we noticed in the Gow's financial submissions, they asserted they owned nearly 7 million of Chase Morgan Capital's 7.8 million shares of stock. So I assumed Chase Morgan was somehow affiliated with JP Morgan Chase, meaning the Gows were probably billionaires. And I'm thinking, well, why would they be seeking a $5 million grant from Lee County? So as you might guess, Chase Morgan Capital actually had no assets. And so then the question becomes, well, why did they bother putting that into their financial statements? It certainly appeared that they were trying to cause people to assume that they owned a lot of a legitimate financial institution. And, this brought up the memories of Orion Bank and Frank Miletto's phony Italian oil leases. And I was kind of thinking, okay, here we go again. And at about the same time, we went down to the museum. I think by now Kufta might have left. No, Kufta was still there. So we went down to the museum and to take a look at the Gow wing, and we learned that the Chinese art donated to the museum was counterfeit. And the museum was in the process of remodeling what had been the Gow wing.
Wow. These people are something else.
And then while we were reviewing the VR Labs articles of incorporation, we learned the company had been created in 2011, 3 months prior to applying for the grant. So it was clearly not an established and successful international operation as it alleged. But the Gows did own Herbal Science Group, which had received legitimately $28 million from credible institutional investors. So then we interviewed John McClellan, who was the former CEO of Herbal Science. And from him, we learned that he'd been hired by Robert Gow after agreeing to raise an additional $2 million for the company. And he managed to bring in $1.5 million, including $250,000 from his mother. But as the CEO, he had no access to Herbal Science Group bank accounts and financial records. And McClellan told us that the Gows lived a very lavish lifestyle, traveling to expensive and exotic places, flying first class, splurging on $2,000 dinners. They paid $11,000 a month for their mortgage, another chunk for expensive auto leases. And he told us that although Herbal Science was trying to develop FDA-approved nutraceuticals, according to McClellan, it had no product and was earning no income. And ultimately, McClellan came to suspect the Gows had blown through the entire $28 million that they'd got from the institutional investors 3 years earlier, and that they had hired McClellan to bring in more money in order to continue funding their lavish lifestyle. And when McClellan finally put his foot down and demanded to see Herbal Science Group's bank account, he was fired, but not before learning that Herbal Science Group had less than $500 left in the bank. So when we plugged McClellan's information into the timeline, we could see that VR Labs was formed and the Gows began applying for funds from Lee County when Herbal Science Group ran out of money. So now we knew the Gows spent a fortune on their personal expenses and that Herbal Science Group was broke and had developed no products that VR Labs could bottle and sell, and that Robert Gow appeared to be impersonating a different Robert Gow as a way of gaining the confidence of those he was seeking to raise money from. So the next significant thing that happened was we interviewed the CEO of an Indiana-based company named A Packaging. He told us that he'd been hired by Kay Gow to build the bottling line for VR Labs. The bottling line was actually completed, but like the other contractors, Kay Gow was refusing to pay the invoice. And as a result, A Packaging refused to ship the bottling line to VR Labs. It's probably worth repeating at this point that the uniquely designed bottling line with the proprietary software that ensured each bottle of nutraceutical had the exact dosage of beneficial ingredients was supposedly what VR Labs was bringing to the table. And now we're learning from a subcontractor that we'd never heard of. It had actually been contracted to build the bottling line. And the records that we had from the county, etc., they did not show any contract between VR Labs and A Packaging. But A Packaging CEO sent us both the proposal that they had submitted to Kay Gow as well as the $400,000 invoice they submitted for the completed bottling line. So just to recap where we're at. Herbal Science and VR Labs are broke. Herbal Science had no product from VR Labs to bottle. VR Labs had no bottling line because it was using to pay a packaging for it. And VR Labs did not have the ability to build the bottling loan on its own. And the county had paid VR Labs $1.7 million for the bottling line. So how did that happen? It gets better. We found out that VR Labs had also contracted with a company named Williams Specialty Bottling to build the bottling line. And our investigation revealed that Kay Gow had caused Williams Specialty Bottling to be incorporated in Florida 3 days after VR Labs signed the agreement with Lee County. So Williams Specialty Bottling didn't even exist at the time this agreement was made.
Wow. I know that there are some people who, as I like to say, would rather stick a needle in their eye than investigate these type of, financial cases. But I always love them because as you're investigating and you find these clear cut signs and evidence of fraud, I get excited.
Absolutely. It is, as you know, it is tedious, painful looking through contracts and emails and documents. But when you find this little needle in a haystack and you're like, I can't swear on your podcast, but this is nonsense, it really is. It's fun. Yeah. And because, like I said, for me, I would have my timeline. And so kind of as you build up the timeline, kind of all that clutter disappears and all there is the timeline and everything is pretty easy to see. So Williams Specialty Bottling, the putative owner of this was a man named John Williams. But emails between Williams and Kay Gow show that she was directing and controlling all of his actions. And it was Kay Gow who instructed Williams. He took the A Packaging proposal, the one that A Packaging had provided to us. It was identical. He had taken that, sent it to VR Labs as a proposal that he's going to build them a bottling line. He changed the cover page so it appeared Williams Specialty Bottling had been hired by VR Labs to build the bottling line that A Packaging had built. So as a result, the A Packaging contract with VR Labs was concealed from the county. And then again, as I mentioned, Williams Specialty Bottling at Kay Gow's direction, invoiced VR Labs $1.7 million for the bottling line, despite the fact that A Packaging had actually built the bottling line for $400,000. And so VR Labs sent an invoice to the county for $1.7 million. The county paid it. And when A Packaging demanded payment from Kay Gow, she said that she had hired Williams Specialty Bottling to build the bottling line and that they had subbed it out to A Packaging, so that it was actually Williams Specialty Bottling that owed him the $400,000. And of course, A Packaging doesn't know anything about Williams Specialty Bottling, so they don't even have the ability to reach out to them. They never communicated with them. All of their communications were with Kay Gow. They'd never heard of Williams Specialty Bottling, so there wasn't like a mechanism for A Packaging to reach out and say, you owe us the money. And then A Packaging gave us their email, so we saw all these communications. And when we looked at the emails that ultimately looked at VR Labs emails, it appeared they had deleted all of their communications, not just with A Packaging, but any sort of trace of what could have been evidence. Those emails were all deleted. So the timeline was really great for that because you could see, okay, there was just an email at this moment saying, send me this now, and then there's no reply email to it. So Kufta and I flew to Virginia to interview John Williams, the putative owner of Williams Specialty Bottling, and we learned from Williams that he'd been friends with Robert Gow for over 20 years and was mesmerized by Gow's alleged history with the CIA. It was almost like he thought that he was participating in some sort of clandestine operation himself. He was an interesting and somewhat entertaining character, but it was clear from speaking to John Williams that Williams Specialty Bottling had no experience in building bottling lines. And it so happened, Williams had invested over $1 million in Herbal Science Group. And what became clear was that Williams Specialty Bottling was created as a vehicle to help Williams recover his $1 million that he had lost in Herbal Science Group, and as a vehicle to funnel Lee County funds back to VR Labs. So in short, Kay Gow directed Williams to invoice VR Labs $1.7 million so she could invoice the county for the bottling line. And once Williams Specialty Bottling was paid for building the bottling line, so she did pay Williams Specialty Bottling the $1.7 million, a bottling line that it was not building, right? Williams was directed to invest the money from the county back into VR Labs.
Which was back into Kay Gow.
Yes, exactly.
Wow.
So the question is, why would Williams, who's got his $1.7 million back, why would he send it back to VR Labs? it appeared Williams had been scammed by the Gows, but he joined their conspiracy in order to recover his losses. And as I said, I think you'd have to talk to him and read the communications. It seemed like he thought it was fun to be getting over on the government. And when Kuft and I asked Williams about charging $1.7 million for a 400,000 bottling line, he replied that he was a farmer and a gambler, and farmers double the price of everything. I don't think he really was a farmer. I think his family owned a farm and that he had inherited a piece of the land, which is where his money came from. And he also claimed that the inflated invoices were to cover his son's expenses. He was saying that his son was developing this proprietary software that was going to cause the bottles to be able to separate out the beneficial ingredients so that each bottle had the exact amount. But his son had no experience in software development. And we interviewed all of the major bottling line manufacturers, including Coca-Cola. And they told us it was impossible to enhance the packaging bottling line. That's what Williams and Kay Gow were trying to say, is that they were really just taking the packaging bottling line, then they were going to put this proprietary software on it. This is after they got caught. This is what they transitioned to, that they were going to put the software on so that the packaging bottling line would perform as they had promised. Everybody we spoke to told us that it would be impossible for there to be any modification of the packaging bottling line without packaging giving Williams Specialty Bottling the instructions as to how their software worked. Any attempted modification would be rejected by the host software. So in the end, the VR Labs grant application was just an elaborate shell game where the Gows were basically borrowing money from the county in hopes they could resuscitate a broken down business, a series of broken down businesses. It actually is a lot more complicated than what I've told you. There were a lot more businesses involved, and there were a lot of investors involved that got scammed. We'd be here for a long time if I went into all of that. But in the end, the case was presented to the grand jury, and in March 2017, the Gows were indicted on 10 counts, including money laundering, wire fraud, and conspiracy. John Williams was charged on 5 counts. And in 2019, Robert and Kay Gow were convicted on all 10 counts, and John Williams was convicted on 3 of the 5.
So they went to trial?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It was one of those strange things because, I was an investigator for, over 30 years when you add my prior career. There was very, very few people in my career where when we targeted someone to try to flip them to cooperation, I can think of just a few. I'm talking about guys who were doing, 40 years on RICO charges, who were at Leavenworth, who I think of one who was just going to do his time. He didn't care about cooperating. I thought for sure John Williams would cooperate, and he didn't. And he went to trial and went down with them. They were convicted in 2019. And after the verdict, prosecutors asked the judge to hold the Gows in custody prior to sentencing because they were attempting to continue this scam in Tucson, Arizona. But the judge released them pending sentencing. And about 2 weeks later, Kay Gow notified the Lee County Sheriff's Office that she had found Robert Gow's body lying in their sauna with a gunshot wound. Responding officers found Robert Gow. He was dead. There was a suicide note and a chrome revolver next to his body.
Wow. So he left her to deal with it all on her own.
Yeah. I didn't ever see the suicide note, so I don't know. In the wreckage of this VR Lab case, you had Lee County employees lost their jobs. Packaging was forced to shutter its doors. The Gow's home was taken in foreclosure proceedings. It was resold for $1.6 million, but they still owed $2.3 million on it. They never contributed a dime of the $9 million that they had promised to the project. John Williams served more than 2 years in prison and lost about $2 million. Robert Gow was dead. Kay Gow is still in prison. She's eligible to be released in 2027. She'll be 80 years old, and that'll be followed by 3 years of supervised release. The taxpayers of Lee County were cheated out of $4.7 million. VR Labs' investigation was an example of an elaborate fraud scheme that was perpetrated against a small community that had access to a very limited amount of law enforcement resources, which I've come to see is how fraudsters identify their victims. They seek out permissive environments where there's little likelihood of ever getting caught. I think at worst, the Gows probably assumed they would be tangled up in lawsuits. They were very litigious, and after already defrauding the taxpayers of Lee County out of $5 million, they were probably countersue the county and subcontractors and media. alleging all of them had conspired to destroy their business. In fact, Kay Gow sent a lot of emails making those very allegations pretty much from the moment VR Labs was first questioned about its failure to pay invoices. And, a lot of businesses and governments will settle lawsuits like that because they can't afford to fight. I say it's like what fishermen refer to tangled lines as birds' nests. Too many knots to untangle, and time spent untangling is time not spent fishing. So they just cut the bird's nest, throw it in the trash, and start over. So I want to make sure that I give credit to the prosecutors and investigators who were involved in these difficult cases. On the Orion Bank case, we had Jim Sweat from the FDIC, Office of Inspector General. We had Steve Carroll, also from the Office of Inspector General, but this for the Federal Reserve Board. Brian Tucker, at the time, was with the IRS. He since moved on to become an executive with the Federal Reserve Board, Office of Inspector General. And the case was prosecuted by my dear friend Nicole Wade, who was actually the chief prosecutor for the Middle District of Florida, and she agreed to take the case on personally because it was so complicated. And then she also took on the VR Labs case. And when Nicole left the United States Attorney's Office, the case was ultimately successfully prosecuted by Rochelle Bedke and Mike Lehman, resulting in the conviction of the Gows and John Williams. I worked that with John Kufta and Special Agent Ryan Davis, two just exceptionally gifted FBI agents. Great job by all of them. Like you, I came to gain a lot of respect for white-collar crime investigations, and FBI's priorities or Department of Justice's priorities shift from administration to administration. And unlike what the public perceives, the FBI has a very limited number of resources and an entire world to cover: terrorism, counterintelligence, cyber attacks, crimes against children, civil rights violations, and too often white collar crime goes into the unaddressed work file, meaning that there's no case is not assigned to an agent. Very few municipalities have the resources to investigate these kinds of cases. So I think it's really important that the FBI stays after this. And I think that your program is such a, fantastic recruitment tool. I know that there's great opportunities in the FBI to be undercover agents or hostage negotiators or members of the hostage rescue team. And a lot of people join the FBI because that's what they want to do. What the FBI depends on more than anything is case agents. Without case agents, there's no case for anybody else to work on. I hope that your audience has listeners out there that are interested in becoming case agents and who also appreciate that even though the glamour assignments are terrorism or the gang cases and stuff, which is what I did and what I love doing, but these white collar cases and especially the corruption cases really is sometimes the hardest but most important work FBI agents do.
Well, I totally agree. In most situations, a local or state law enforcement agency just doesn't have the resources, the time, the personnel to devote months, maybe even years to untangling these complicated white-collar crime, fraud, and corruption cases.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And the harm caused to victims of the fraudsters is real. It's ordinary people, taxpayers. Just ask the people of Lee County and who lost their jobs, VR Labs investors who lost their money, all the Orion Bank employees who lost their life savings and their jobs. So shout out to the case agents.
I also want to give a shout out to the two names that you mentioned. You mentioned Brett Hood and John Kufta. Both of them have been guests on this podcast, but I especially want to say something about John Kufta because it was just announced that he will be the recipient of the FBI Agents Association's Distinguished Service Honors Award in November. And I'm just so excited for him because he is being recognized for his bravery and his sacrifice.
Jerry's moving and powerful interview of John Kufta is must listen. It's episode 267. And if you haven't heard it, you need to look it up, stop whatever you're doing and press play because it is awesome.
You have presented two, as I like to say, fascinating case reviews about fraud and white-collar crime cases. We're at the point of the episode where I like to learn a little bit more about you. So When and why did you join the FBI?
So I had been an investigator for the public defender's office in Boston, and I was going to law school at nights. My plan was to become an attorney. But after 5 years of being an investigator, working with both prosecutors and defense attorneys, I came to see that attorneys are required to advocate for their case. They're required to take facts and try to persuade a jury about how they should perceive those facts. And I felt that as an investigator, my only allegiance was to the truth. That mattered to me. And so the best place to be an investigator, in my mind, was with the FBI. So I joined the FBI in 1990, and I retired in 2014.
Now, you had mentioned that in addition to being at the Fort Myers RA and picking up this bank fraud case, that a good part of your career was working violent crime matters. So what would you say were some of the things that you enjoyed most about your career?
So I spent the first 10 years of my career in Miami investigating violent gangs, in particular the Jamaican posses. That was really rewarding work. We solved a lot of murders. Jamaican posses were responsible for, in the 80s and 90s, for just an enormous amount of murders throughout the U.S., as well as Kingston, Jamaica, and Canada, London, other places. That was how I spent the first 10 years of my career. And then I was promoted to build and supervise the Whitey Bulger Task Force up in Boston. And so I ran the Bulger Task Force as well as the gang investigations in Boston. And then I was promoted to the ASAC in Boston over the criminal branch before being shipped off to Iraq as the senior executive in charge of essentially a 120-person field office in Iraq. I was the legal attaché in Canada. So from that perspective, you kind of oversee all of the FBI's violations. There was primarily counterterrorism, counterintelligence. And then I stepped down, finished my career back on the street in Fort Myers, really doing what my heart was all about, which was, being a street investigator. What I really liked doing, felt like I was better at that than anything else I'd ever done.
You certainly had a variety of assignments during your career, which allows for you to have a lot of stories to tell. So why don't we talk a little bit about what you're doing now?
I founded my company, the Justice Group. Mostly what I was doing was working with police departments, essentially internal affairs, internal audits for police departments that were struggling either with the community or internally. That was kind of the main work I was doing. But I started writing a book. I started writing it all the way back in 2008 when I was in Iraq. But I finally had a manuscript, and somebody suggested that I take it to Thriller Fest in Manhattan. And I took it there 2 years ago, this manuscript, and I met Terry Wolf from AKA Literary, who eventually signed me. She's now my agent. She had me convert over the past 2 years my manuscript into a 3-story series. It's a fictional series about a female FBI agent, idealist, young school teacher who joins the FBI after 9/11 and coincidentally fights gangs, Jamaican posses in Miami, and then militias in Iraq, which are just kind of better armed gangs. And then in the third book, she returns to sleepy Southwest Florida, thinking she's escaped the enemies she's met along the way. And she finds out that they're not quite done with her. And I know you've got some stories of your own, some books that are at an exciting point. So hopefully we'll both be talking about each other's books soon.
Yeah, that would be so cool. It sounds like your books are based on some of the cases that you worked throughout your career.
My books are fiction, and
I should use the word inspired then.
Inspired, yes. I don't know who said it, but somebody said you should write about what you know. And so, my books are about experience that I've had that, for example, the Jamaican posse is something that I know really well, and I don't know that anybody else has ever really written about.
I have to ask you why you decided to make your main character, a female FBI agent.
There's a couple of reasons. One is that I wanted to make it clear that it was fiction. I'm not the character in the book. But also, I hate to talk in superlatives, but the best agents that I ever worked with were women. And I just kind of felt like I wanted to write something that honored my perspective on their journey. I think it's harder to be, or at least when I was there, it was harder to be a female FBI agent than a male agent from my perspective.
And from mine too.
So I think that you all bring so much to the table that I don't know as a guy. I wanted to share how much I respect the different skills and perspectives that I felt like the women agents I work with brought to me. And I learned so much from them. And I tried to incorporate that into my story.
Well, I can't wait to read it.
And I can't wait to read yours.
We're at the time now where I like to give my guest the last word. So what would you like to say?
Well, first off, I'd like to say thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to be on. It's been really enjoyable talking with you. People always ask me, what's it like to be an FBI agent? What do FBI agents do? Seems like that's something that's a lot of curiosity for people. I tell them FBI agents do a lot of things, a lot of fun things, a lot of different things. But fundamentally, the most important thing we do is we get people to tell us things that they never thought that they would tell anyone. And in order to do that, you have to get people to trust you. And the way you build trust is by treating people with respect. And I learned that through dealing with very dangerous people. Most of my career, I was dealing with very dangerous people. And I learned that you might have really strong feelings about somebody or about the crimes they've committed. But if you let a defendant or a witness see that, they're not going to trust you. They're not going to tell you those secrets that you need to know in order to be successful. And so what I'll mention is at the sentencing for the Orion Bank defendants, Frank Miletto, Angel Durzon, Tom Hebel, each of them went before the judge and admitted their wrongdoing and apologized. And then each of them in turn turned to the government table and personally thanked me for how I treated them. Now, I say that not to pat myself on the back, but I say that for any young agent, a current agent, or aspiring agent who listens to your show, that sometimes the most important tool you have in your toolbox is compassion. Having compassion for people, being able to treat people with respect, no matter how you feel personally, is the starting point if you want to get somebody to trust you. And so I just encourage all FBI agents or future agents to not let their personal feelings about a crime or about a defendant prevent them from being successful.
And that's the end of the interview. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a direct link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com, where you'll find a photo of retired agent Tom Larned, as well as case-related images and links to articles about the Orion Bank failure and the VR Labs wire fraud. There's also a link to more FBI Case File Review episodes featuring fraud investigations. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist, where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.